Hello there, I'm Ramsey Campbell and I write horror. Indeed, I'm celebrating my 60th year in print. Having begun in terms of any kind of a professional publication by imitating H.P. Lovecraft, very slavishly to begin with, progressively less so. And now and then I still attempt to scale the heights that Lovecraft established, most recently in a trilogy of Lovecraftian novels. But basically, horror is my life. It's what I love, among other things. And I hope to share a few insights with my great friend S.T. Joshi.
Yeah, here I am, S.T. Joshi, all the way back in Seattle, Washington, bright and early this morning. Like Ramsey, I got started pretty early as a writer, although I gravitated toward literary criticism early on, although not sure I knew much about criticism at the time, but I just plunged into the field, and Lovecraft was my focus for a good many years. He just fascinated me for a long time, and still does. But through Lovecraft, I went to other writers like Stoker, Arthur Machen, Lord Dunsany, Algernon Blackwood, and not least Ramsey Campbell himself. I've done as much study of Ramsey's work as I can, and it's such an incredibly rich body of work. I've written one or two books about him and compiled his bibliography based on his own work, and I've dealt with a lot of different authors, early and recent, and I'm still at it.
And we're going to talk, I gather, mainly about Bram Stoker and Lovecraft as two of the influences on 20th century and indeed 21st century horror and in popular culture as well. Okay, let me reminisce just a little bit, because I mean, I'm sure things were different in America, S.T., but in Britain, it was extraordinarily difficult to find Lovecraft in any quantity until I reached my adolescence. I mean, when 14 years old in 1960, this was when the very first Lovecraft paperback appeared. And so I was familiar, well, much more familiar with Bram Stoker, specifically Dracula, several years earlier than that. You couldn't come across many of his short stories so easily, but I think it would be fair to say that if we talk about Stoker, it's Dracula above all that was influential. I mean, he wrote some effective short stories, of The Judge's House, for instance, which is a kind of riff on Mr. Justice Harbottle, the Le Fanu story, and indeed Carmilla, which from which Dracula proceeds to an extent. Although there are other influences on Stoker, I think, there too. Stoker wrote other novels. The Duel of the Seven Stars is effective, I think. The Lair of the White Worm is well, as Lovecraft described, I think its development he described as almost infantile, and I think that's a fair summation of it. Last time, it was also made into a very silly film by Ken Russell, but then most Ken Russell films are pretty silly. That's by the way. Dracula, I think, influences the field as much in terms of popular culture in the way that it became represented in film, as much as it does in fiction. I mean, the original novel is crucial in one way in particular, which is the way that it amasses various kinds of documents, letters and diaries and medical records and the like, and puts them together to suggest far more than it often shows. And it's also fairly radical, or well, radical may be the word. Maybe you would think of another SG, but certainly in terms of showing the monster, bringing him on center stage very early in the novel, and allowing him to declare himself and establish himself in considerable detail and vividness for several chapters, and then taking him off into the wings. And so he becomes this sort of presence very much behind the scenes, or perceived on the periphery of the action. And it's a long time before he comes back into proper view. The only other novel I can think of, which oddly enough is a competitor, whether this was simply a coincidence or the other author learning from Stoker, because I'm not quite sure of the chronology here, is The Beetle, the Richard Marsh novel, where again in the opening chapter the monster is shown pretty explicitly, even down to his shape-changing abilities. And then again, he disappears from the narrative for quite a while. But I guess, I don't know, would you say that the Dracula was influential more in terms of the films than in terms of the novels, or not?
Oh, no question about it. And in terms of the relationship between Dracula and the Beetle by Richard Marsh, they came out in the same year, 1897. So I would doubt an influence. Lovecraft himself thought there was an influence, but I think it's rather unlikely. One interesting point, and I'm sure many people have made this, but the novel Dracula itself wasn't hugely popular right at the time of publication. It was, the reviews of it were actually quite mixed. I mean, some were positive, some were quite otherwise. Really speaking, Dracula became this immense icon in popular culture through not just the films, but earlier even than that. In 1924, an Irish actor named Hamilton Deane wrote a play, a stage play of Dracula. Now, back before, this is the time when movies weren't quite as dominant at all as they are now. The thing to do was to adapt a novel as a stage play, and many times this was done for lots of works. So that was done by Hamilton Deane, and then 3 years later, John Balderston, an American playwright, adapted that adaptation, and it appeared on Broadway, not 28, 29, I can't remember when, starring Bela Lugosi in the stage play, and that is how Mr. Lugosi became Dracula in the film, because Todd Browning, the director of that film of 1931, saw Lugosi on Broadway in that role, and he says, well, all right, maybe you're right for the part in this film. And it's only then, of course, that the concept of Dracula as the prototypical vampire really took off. Although, Ramsey, we have to consider Nosferatu. Maybe you want to talk about Nosferatu.
Yes, well, I mean, that is the first, although uncredited, unofficial indeed, well, I think we must say plagiaristic version of Dracula on film by F.W. Murnau in 1922. And I would say it is one of the great screen vampire movies. It had a real sense of the Gothic, of decay, actually. And it picks up on certain elements in the novel that most films don't treat of. For instance, the rats on board the ship, the Demeter, that brings Dracula to well, actually not England in the Murnau film, it's to Germany, but it has by far the most monstrous Dracula on film. I mean, he is a genuine night creature, to the extent that rumor had it that Max Schreck really looked that way. It was kept under wraps for the rest of the. In fact, of course, there is the movie Shadow of the Vampire, made much more recently, where Willem Dafoe plays Schreck as effectively a sort of supernatural figure. In fact, Schreck, whose name, clearly the Schreck, the name itself in German has a particular significance, was much more prolific than that, and was in fact made up very thoroughly to appear inhuman. Although some argument would say he's made up to look very Semitic. I don't know whether to what extent that argument holds. Although certainly there is the remake by Werner Herzog, which doesn't make him look quite the same, but uses Wagner on the soundtrack to, I would have thought, eloquent effect.
Yeah. I mean, you should point out that when Nosferatu came out, Stoker's widow and presumably his literary executor, Florence, was outraged, and justifiably so. It really was an unacknowledged or adaptation of Dracula. So she sued for copyright infringement and won the suit. And I believe that 1922 film was therefore not shown for many decades. I mean, several decades. It simply wasn't available. But of course, now both the novel and the film are now in public domain, so you can see them.
Yes. Now I remember, funnily enough, an American fan, Betty Kujawa, who was instrumental in starting my career and recommending, as I said, I saw it to August Derleth at Arkham House. It was a completely different issue. That she mentioned to me in correspondence in the very early 60s that she'd seen this on American television and thought it was by far the most frightening vampire film she'd ever seen. So it obviously did surface in some form. But actually, Florence Stoker attempted to have all copies destroyed. I think I might say no negatives now exist, but after a great deal of restoration, there's some pretty wonderful versions on Blu-ray to be had, which shows complete as you could possibly get. And for a long time, it was very much a piecemeal thing that you saw anyway. Often reels were out of order, whole sequences were, misplaced within the film. But now I think we're seeing it pretty well as it's meant to be seen. I suppose if I have to make an argument for a favourite to Dracula, it would very probably be in terms of the overall film. It would be the first Hammer film with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, which I think is a really a little miracle of compression as much as anything. Jimmy Sangster's script, which takes a considerable amount of the novel. I mean, it does in fact. Well, like the Murnau actually plays some liberties with Stoker and has, for instance, Jonathan Harker being a conscious vampire destroyer who's gone to the castle in the opening sequences in order to see off Dracula, which of course he fails to do. But still it has some very remarkable scenes in it, and still that iconic performance by Christopher Lee. It's interesting that so much was left over from Stoker's novel that Jimmy Sangster was able to pillage it for other material for several sequels, most of which are pretty interesting. Certainly The Brides of Dracula, although as huge a misnomer as you've ever heard in the cinema, given that the film begins with the words "Dracula is dead," so whoever the brides are, they're not Dracula's brides, but all the same, a rather fine, full of ideas, that film.
And isn't there a certain film that you have a particular fondness for called Dracula's Daughter?
Oh, well, I am fond of that. Yes, that was technically the first official sequel, with Gloria Talbot as the lady of the title. It's never really made entirely clear whether she is Dracula's daughter or not. I mean, she clearly is, related to him in some way. It's also the very first film, I think I'm correct in saying, which has the consequences. After all, Edward Van Sloan has driven a stake through this body, and the local police come along and duly arrest him for what appears to be a murder. Because, interestingly enough, in this film, the Dracula does not crumble to dust, as would usually be the case in later films, and so it's left to Dracula's daughter to appear, to claim the remains. In fact. And it's quite a subtly understated film, and her performance in particular is quite delicate. It also has, I mean, by now we're in the midst of the early days of the Hays Code, so nothing could be too explicit. And indeed, apparently the film was, the original script was far more horrific. It was trounced by the censor, and so it had to be toned down. But they still managed to slip through what is really a pretty unmistakable, though delicate, lesbian episode with Nan Gray, her model, because Dracula's daughter is posing as an artist. And yes, it's a striking little film, and it deserves rediscovery. Well, it has been rediscovered on Blu-ray by now.
I'm sure, but you're obviously too humble to note that you wrote novelization, didn't you?
Well, I wrote the novel based on the film. That's perfectly true. But it was well, it was my bid to enshrine the film in print. Yes.
In terms of the film adaptations, I'm actually quite partial to the Frank Langella Dracula, which I think also was initially a stage play.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
I mean, it does bring out the sexual allure of Dracula, as a lot of other films don't. I mean, quite frankly, Mr. Lugosi is not exactly a ladies' man in that sense, but the novel clearly is. I mean, let's be honest with it. The vampire is a kind of stand-in for a sexual predator. Let's be
oh
honest.
Yes, very much so. A seducer. Yes, that's right. It's interesting that some of the elements of the novel rather get kind of glossed over, even blotted out by subsequent popular adaptations, because in the novel, daylight is not really an issue. Dracula can be seen in daylight. And it's only later on that he becomes increasingly nervous of it, and it becomes lethal to him. Actually, that's one thing I think I'm right in saying, that the Coppola film, which I have a certain fondness for that film. Actually, it's almost a kind of tribute to every major vampire film that precedes it. And I think it's certainly made out of a love of the material. I think, whatever you may feel about its shortcomings in some areas.
Yeah, I just wish he hadn't called it Bram Stoker's Dracula, because obviously it's not Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's not.
No, it's Coppola's Dracula. That's absolutely right. Yeah. Now, in terms of actual literary heritage, I mean, one of the odd things that happens, I think, is when people start reusing Dracula, there's increasingly which I mean, is not something I particularly care for. This attempt to humanize him and give him a backstory. Well, of course, actually, to be fair, in the Stoker, he actually has got a considerable history, which he talks about in considerable detail to Jonathan Harker. But I think there's an increasing attempt to make him more human and less monstrous. And this is something that overtakes the vampire in fiction as a whole until we get, the Twilight style of vampire, almost the lovable vampire, and it then becomes kind of difficult to may one say claw back the monster and make him or not him specifically Dracula, but the vampire in general, a figure of terror, of dread. I mean, I had a go myself in a novel recently, and let me say, and this may be a good link for us to go into something else here, into our other theme, that at the back of my mind was the nearest thing to a vampire story that Lovecraft ever wrote, because of course Lovecraft was not by any means partial to the conventional figures of horror fiction, or indeed the conventional occultism that was in particular the Victorian and Edwardian eras had established. And so I'm thinking very much of the shunned house, where I think Lovecraft does make a kind of vampire truly monstrous and barely glimpsed. In fact, we see only enough to suggest how much more monstrous that vampire is.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. One of my favorite quotations about Lovecraft from a critic is the early critic from the 1950s, Peter Penzold, who says Lovecraft is too well read. What he meant by that, and I see the point of it, Lovecraft was a voracious reader of weird fiction from a very early age on. He discovered Poe at the age of 8 and on and on. Although it's in some ways it's surprising how late he was discovering some of his own contemporaries. He only got to Lord Dunsany in 1919, Arthur Machen in 1923, Blackwood even later than that, and M.R. James. But he had read very widely in the field. And I think surprisingly early on, he had come to the decision, a lot of these themes, the vampire, the werewolf, the ghost, they're all played out. I need to do something different. And I think what Lovecraft did critically was to base his conceptions of horror on something outside. Because he says that is still a realm that is lesser known. We don't know what is really out there, and in that process he made a fusion between conventional horror and the developing field of science fiction, and that's where Lovecraft's real value lies, in my impression.
Oh yes, well that's one way, but also in terms of of impeccable structure in his greatest work and modulation of language. I always come back to this because there's this parodic notion, and sadly, it's not pervaded just by his detractors, but sometimes by his admirers. Not us, obviously, because we know better. But this whole notion that Lovecraft was little but purple prose, and in something like The Rats and the Wolves or the Call of Cthulhu, the color out of space, nothing could be further than the truth. I mean, the prose is very, very carefully modulated, and the words, the paragraphs, the sentences, they're all chosen with extraordinary care for the precise effect. Now, obviously, Lovecraft goes back to Poe in that regard, because he admired Poe for those very qualities. And indeed, one of the things about his great essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, which is one of the first, one of the key works of, critical works and appreciations of the field, is that in a sense, I mean, I suppose this is like most writers really writing critically, that he's, in a way, he's talking about himself and his own ambitions for the field. When he praises Poe, for a great length, the selection of detail, the precise selection of language and so forth, and Blackwood for his sense of the alien, the other, although he decries him for what he describes as journalistic style, there's still, I think, the sense that Lovecraft admired Blackwood greatly at his best was stories like, say, The Willows and the Wendigo, for a real sense of something bordering on the cosmic, which obviously, as you say, Lovecraft would develop in a much larger way. And it's interesting, isn't it, that, Hope Hodgson is often cited as well, there was an affinity, but of course, quite wrongly, as an influence on Lovecraft, because Lovecraft didn't actually read the novels of Hope Hodgson until 1934. Things like The House on the Borderland. And by now, Lovecraft is very close to the end of his career. And certainly all of Lovecraft's preoccupations are well in place, and his methods are well in place. Though I have wondered sometimes whether maybe The House on the Borderland could have suggested the kind of scope of The Shadow Out of Time, or whether Lovecraft was trying to find, a different way to voyage into the remotest realms of experience, in a way that Hodgson tries as well.
Yeah, actually, somebody wrote a good essay on Hodgson's influence on that story. He actually brings forth the Nightland even as a possible influence on that story. Even though Lovecraft was had mixed reactions to that Nightland, but it's a tremendous imaginative achievement, whatever you think of the very bizarre prose in which it is written. But of course, the cosmic element in Lovecraft began virtually with his very first story, The Dagon, which is 1917. And I think we should go into the fact that a lot of that cosmic element came not only from his philosophical point of view, but from his learning of science.
Yes.
He was a great devotee of science from very early on. He studied chemistry at the age of 8. He found astronomy in particular at the age of 12, and that really opened his mind to what he thought was the boundless realms of space and time. And that I have to tell you, I don't believe a whole lot of people in our field really have the kind of scientific background that Lovecraft had, even as an amateur. I mean, he was never went to college, never even graduated from high school, but he was a tremendous self-taught individual. But science was a major factor in his whole outlook.
Yeah, and in fact, he wrote a column on astronomy, did he not? At an appallingly early age for a local journal.
Yeah, or actually, he wrote at the age of 16. He wrote 2 different astronomy columns for local papers, and then around 1914, he was 24. He wrote a monthly column for about 4 years. Until the paper said, "Oh, your writing is too complicated. It's too dense for our readership." Maybe the readers are the ones who are dense.
Well, yes.
So it stopped. But I'll tell you, the scientific underpinning of Lovecraft's works, especially things like At the Mountains of Madness and also Shadow Out of Time, which are his 2 most cosmic works, is most impressive. And really, it's very hard to find any other writer in our field who have that kind of background, because that takes you sort of into the realm of science fiction, really.
Oh yes, very definitely. I mean, there are. I mean, Stoker to a certain extent had a scientific background. I mean, I suppose one thinks, but it's interesting. I kind of think of Arthur Machen and something like The Great God Pan. But I suppose we could argue there that it's apparent how little scientific background Machen actually had, because he's obviously making up his science as he goes along in that story, which is not to decry the story. I suppose again that is an early example, although a less developed one of that whole use of a number of different narratives and documents to put together a larger whole. But I mean, I suppose we would agree that one of the great examples of that method is indeed the Call of Cthulhu, if we pronounce him that way.
Yeah, well, I think Lovecraft in that regard was influenced not so much by Stoker's Dracula, but by Macken's novel of the Black Seal. That is a tremendous instance of what Lovecraft called the piecing together of dissociated knowledge, reveals a whole that each individual piece cannot show by itself. And I think Lovecraft learned a lot from that. I mean, in that sense, Mr. Penzolt's comment that Lovecraft was too well read has some validity. There is a lot of influence on Lovecraft, but in many ways, in fact, in almost every instance, I think Lovecraft transmuted these influences and made them his own because of the power of his own imagination.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's worth saying, I think he was he not, I would think, the first writer in our field really to unite the British and the American traditions. And on the one hand, he's taken from Poe and from Bierce to a certain extent. I mean, I've always felt that the titles of the paintings in Pickman's model are quintessentially Biercean, like something out of the Devil's Dictionary almost. And on the other hand, we have in Britain, specifically Blackwood and Machen. and to a much lesser extent R. James. But I find it interesting that, Lovecraft reads ghost stories of an antiquary in 1926, and he then writes the Call, and he writes Pickman's Model. Now, in Canon Alberic's scrapbook, which is the first of the ghost stories of an antiquary, we have the line, let me see, I can't remember the precise, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but it's an image of the demonic creature that will show up at the end of the story. And everybody, as James puts it, everybody who sees it feels that it has been taken from the life. Now, I see a kind of an echo there in Pickman's Model, and whether that was the seed of that story, who can ever know? But it just occurs to me that that's an interesting point. And the other thing that I think he does take from the Canon Alberic's scrapbook is this whole notion of showing an image, an actual, I forget precisely, it's not a mezzo, it's too early for that, an engraving it would be, I suppose, in the M.R. James, of the monster. So that when you bring it on at the end, you don't have to describe it in detail, but approach it, make its presence felt in a different way. And again, this is very much what Lovecraft does in The Call, do you not think?
Yeah, and I think Lovecraft was influenced by James Count Magnus in something like the case of Charles Dexter Ward. Again, a British scholar actually some years ago wrote a good paper on the influence of that story. I don't remember the details, but the case he made was quite convincing. Yeah, Lovecraft was overwhelmed by James. He was this author he should have known long before, and he just, it was a real revelation to him, even though Lovecraft, wasn't a traditional ghost story writer. In fact, he never wrote about a ghost as such ever, I don't believe. But nevertheless, he was so impressed by the skill with which James wrote that he certainly, a lot of it sunk in. But the one big difference in terms of Stoker's and Lovecraft's influence, I believe, and we're getting toward this anyway, is whereas I don't know that a whole lot of writers imitated Stoker as such, whereas hundreds, perhaps thousands of people have imitated Lovecraft writers. Whereas Lovecraft's work in the film is, shall we say, not entirely satisfactory. There are lots of film adaptations out there, but to my estimation, they're quite poor mostly.
Yeah, there are a few really good ones. I absolutely agree. I'm just peripherally reminded here now the one curious instance of the influence of Stoker, or perhaps that's what it is, but I really mustn't say definitely that it could be. There's a very curious book about the Highgate vampire, published in Britain, in which is written by the chap who says that he actually hunted down and staked this very vampire that inhabited Highgate Cemetery. And there are an extraordinary number of parallels with Stoker, almost, stylistic devices, and you might almost think images about Dracula himself. One of the interesting things about the Highgate vampire, according to this book, is that the vampire apparently has the effect on 1970s teenage girls of making them speak and write like Victorian young women. So perhaps this is an effect of vampirism that we'd not previously considered. Just as Kim Newman points out that vampires have a penchant for anagrammatizing their own names, which of course is perfectly true. I mean, Dracula in various films does it, and of course Carmilla certainly does it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about literary influences from Stoker, I actually don't see a whole lot of influence directly on somebody like Anne Rice.
No.
I think she was probably more influenced by the films, if anything, than by Stoker's own text.
Yes, I think that's true. And I mean, again, something like Salem's Lot, which is, which Steve King himself cites as, having bounced off Dracula, but stylistically, no, there's no trace of it at all, I would have thought. Whereas Lovecraft, of course, there is, and I don't mean this in the wrong way, and I'm sure you know what I mean when I say this, S.T., in a way there's far too much, in the sense that far too many people tend to imitate the easy bits, if you like, the purple prose. And let me say at once, I was one of the first, and I can only bow my head in shame, because some of the early stuff that quite rightly August Derleth insisted I tone down really did get it entirely wrong and indulge in the bits that Lovecraft built up to so carefully. I just took them as being the way you should pitch the entire narrative. You will, of course, have heard me do my telegram, will you not? Perhaps I should do this for the audience. What do you think?
Go ahead.
There's an early story of mine. Well, actually, one of the very first stories I submitted to August Derleth. It's called The Tomb Herd, as it then was, in which the narrator's friend, who is well, has been made away with by now by the monsters in the town of Temple, has sent him a telegram which is never sent. And I think by now I've done it so often I could probably remember it word for word. And if I may ask you to remember, this is a telegram. It goes thus: to Richard Dexter, come at once. You are needed urgently by me here as protection against agencies which may kill me, or worse, if you do not come immediately. Will explain as soon as you get here, ... But what is this that flops unspeakably down the corridor towards this room? It cannot be that abomination that I saw in the nitrous vaults beneath the accursed church in Asquith Place. Ja, Schubnigeref Cthulhu Tan. And in fact, you can now see why the telegram was never accepted by the post office.
Yes, quite. Well, you were actually picking up on, well, some of the things, some of the more silly parts of Lovecraft himself. Although there's when he revised Adolphe de Castro's dreadful story, The Diary of Alonzo Typer. Mr. Typer apparently ends, with a diary entry saying "ah" at the end.
I'm being dragged away towards the cellar, as I remember.
Exactly. So Lovecraft could become pretty silly himself, but I think that was just a story he was revising.
I think it was, I generally believe that some of those revisions come close to deliberate parodies. He was actually,
yes, I think so.
You sort of suspect he was having fun, actually, of a kind.
Right. But the funny thing is that during Lovecraft's own lifetime, he did encourage, or at least I wouldn't, let's say, didn't discourage people from writing, imitations or elaborations upon his own ideas. Frank Belknap Long was the first, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, Robert Bloch, and of course, well, we don't want to go too much into this, but Mr. August Derleth. Let me just say my general take on Derleth is that he actually fundamentally misunderstood Lovecraft, and because he himself became Lovecraft's publisher and sort of, in a sense, an authorized spokesman, his view of Lovecraft, which I believe was fundamentally mistaken, dominated critical discourse for 3 or 4 decades until he finally died in 1971. And yet he did a lot of good in his life. I'll tell you, in founding Arkham House, if Derleth had done nothing but publish the first books of H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Fritz Leiber, Ray Bradbury, and Ramsey Campbell, he would be deserved to be remembered, and he is remembered for that.
He is indeed. He is indeed. No, I mean, yes, I think it's perfectly true that Lovecraft himself felt that Derleth lacked a sense of the cosmic, and I think that's really where the problem lay. An earth gazer was Lovecraft's term, I think. Yes,
but I think he did great service to you by saying, "Look, Ramsey, you're not familiar with New England. There's no point here setting stories in New England. Why don't you set those stories in a place which is England?"
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Although the irony was, I didn't actually know the area that I used, which was the Cotswolds, all that well. But obviously, it was not so glaringly apparent to an American editor that I hadn't really been there. But as you say, I do appreciate it, the help that he gave me, not least by telling me not to write telegrams like the ones I just performed for everybody. But I think, to me, well, let's say this before we get on perhaps to contemporary Lovecraftian fiction, that in many ways he was most crucial in terms of those authors he didn't directly influence, but who learned from his example. So Fritz Leiber, as you say, is an obvious example. I mean, Fritz used to say that Lovecraft,
convinced him that how horror fiction could be, and indeed was, literature, and it was partly Lovecraft's correspondence with him. I think that's one thing that was really crucial, that the correspondence that Lovecraft had with these various writers, that it wasn't necessarily so much the imitation of Lovecraft as the sense of the importance and the literary qualities of the field that Lovecraft inculcated that have a sort of a lasting effect. Because, I mean, when Fritz attempted, he did write a couple of Lovecraftian stories, The Terror from the Depths in particular. He doesn't imitate Lovecraft's style. He does his own, I think, pretty witty thing. And also, I think probably his most Lovecraftian story, in some ways, in terms of not using the mythos, but just the general cosmic sense, is a bit of the Dark World, which I think is a genuinely Lovecraftian and cosmic tale, where, you know, the various glimpses are only metaphors for what is never directly perceived. And that, I suppose, goes all the way back to something like The Willows as well.
Yeah, I mean, Leiber, actually, I believe he said something like Lovecraft, along with Shakespeare, these were the two most important authors in my development, and that's important in saying development, because he's suggesting that both Lovecraft and Shakespeare taught him how to be a writer, and he put that into practice later on. And Bloch too, Robert Bloch, you know, as a teenager started writing the Lovecraft and writing these really flamboyant stories, certainly entertaining in their way. But Lovecraft, constant in 4 years of correspondence, said, you know, Robert, you got to tone this down.
That's
you know,
right.
He of all people, you know, recognized that his own early work might have been a little more florid than it needed to be, and later on he himself toned his prose down, and he was constantly urging Robert to do that. And then look what happened. Bloch ends up writing Psycho, which is an incredibly, I believe that is a great work of non-supernatural horror. It's a suspense work too, but it's also horror, and written with the kind of you know, austere prose that you would find in a hard-boiled novel or something like that. And so belatedly, Robert Bloch did learn that lesson from Lovecraft.
Yes, I mean, I'd also take that a little bit further in terms of Psycho. I've always felt, I've said this to you before, that, you know, it's a bit of a riff on The Thing on the Doorstep. I mean, both are about basically people who are possessed by the essence or the influence of a corpse in the cellar, fundamentally, and certainly by the end of Bloch's novel, or the climax of it. You know, there's also which I mean, in many ways, the Hitchcock film is a great film, I think, and Bob actually himself was very fond of the film, even though he, you know, resented then being identified by forevermore as, you know, the man who wrote Psycho, which he said would be on his tombstone. Maybe it is, I don't know. Maybe it should be. But in the novel, I'm right in saying that Norman Bates has a shelf of occult books, which is a very suggestive detail. Now, the film omits that, and it's not absolutely crucial, but, you know, it certainly does have that little bit of a resonance of Lovecraft there, I think.
Sure, absolutely. And I'll tell you, well, not to toot my own horn, as it were, but August Derleth died in 1971. It was right around then that a new group of people were starting to look at Lovecraft more deeply, and we really affected, I believe, a sort of scholarly revolution. I was a small part of that early on, and then kind of took the lead later. But people like Dirk Mosig, Richard L. Tierney, who's still with us, thank heaven, you know, they started saying, look, these the incrustations of misinterpretation that Derleth put on Lovecraft have to be scraped away. We have to get to the essence of Lovecraft. And I think we accomplished that goal in showing that Lovecraft really is about cosmic alienation and other things like that, and not about just the monsters or place names or forbidden books and things like that. So I think eventually that played a role in how creative writers started looking at Lovecraft and starting to use these conceptions of Lovecraft as springboards for their own ideas, rather than just mechanically imitating the Lovecraftian externals.
Yeah, you know, in a weird way, I'm just, this is just off the top of my head, I'm kind of reminded of the sort of recent trend towards historical practice in musical performance, and sort of scraping away the, you know, the excesses of romanticism you got in some performances of Bach for a while, you know, and Mozart and so forth.
Now, here's something that occurs to me. I'll throw this to you, ST, just for your opinion. I think that not in terms of the cosmic, well, not precisely, but stylistically, one contemporary writer who occasionally reminds me of Lovecraft in some ways is Cormac McCarthy. And in particular, the Outer Dark novel, an early novel of his, interesting enough, actually has words like eldritch and nameless in it. And I've always wondered whether this is a complete coincidence or whether maybe, there's an admirer who hasn't admitted to being one. Don't know.
Well, yeah, I think Lovecraft's influence has covertly seeped into a far wider realm than perhaps we're aware of. For example, I remember one of my great favorite writers is Gore Vidal, and when he wrote his memoir Palimpsest, he just drops in a reference to Lovecraft, the Eldritch Horror of Lovecraft or something like that, as if he expects everybody to know the reference. He doesn't have to explain it. And so it's just it's out there, and sometimes it's acknowledged, sometimes it isn't. But in terms of those people who are specifically working in the Lovecraftian tradition, right now and doing it well, I think 2 or 3 stand out. I mean, Caitlin Kiernan, without question, I think is one of the greatest writers of weird fiction of her generation. I would have said almost of the present day, excepting you, of course. But you two, I think, are at the top of the field, and Caitlin has done some incredible work, both in the Lovecraftian vein and outside the Lovecraftian vein.
He certainly has, yes.
And in fact, you should. I believe there was a large omnibus of her Lovecraftian work published by Centipede Press. Unfortunately, that's a very expensive volume, but
yes. Now she's someone who really does deserve to be better known in Britain. I mean, there's very little of her work published here, so maybe someone who's listening right now, and we won't name any names, might consider doing such a book, and I think we'd be very happy to see it.
And I'll tell you,
one of us might even write the introduction.
Maybe I've written introductions to several of her works.
So have I.
And talk about, I mean, the beauty of her prose, which very not Lovecraftian in any sense, but it's just gorgeous prose. I mean, it's worth reading just for the prose. But I'll tell you, and she has a really strong scientific background, which I think is one of the real keys to tying her to Lovecraft. I mean, she actually is a PhD in like invertebrate paleontology or some abstruse field like that. So she knows her stuff. But another writer that I personally am rather fond of, maybe because I sort of nurtured him at the start, is Jonathan Thomas, and he's certainly not at all well known, but he too is just about to come out with a big omnibus of his Lovecraftian writings from Centipede Press. It's going to be called Malign Providence. That's a play on the town of Providence likes to call itself Divine Providence as a joke, but and he lives in Providence and sets many of his stories there. And he wrote a superb Lovecraftian novel called The Color Over Occam, not Arkham, but Occam, Occam. That's we won't get into that, but that came out around 2011 or so, and really, really fine novel. But who are some of your favorite contemporary Lovecraftians?
Well, now, in terms of the general area, certainly John Langan, I have a great deal of admiration for. I mean, I very much like The Fisherman, and by gum, that is genuine cosmic horror. I think of a very strange way. I mean, it obviously does have, it kind of touches upon the Bible, but only in order to create something, much more monstrous and strange. I think Victor Laval is doing some very interesting stuff, actually. The Ballad of Black Tom, now, which is, of course, one of those stories where you really do need to have read what it's referring to. It's a sort of a critique of the horror at Red Hook, which is, I think we would agree, not one of Lovecraft's better stories. One of the other things about the horror at Red Hook is that, unusually for Lovecraft, in terms of what we discussed earlier on, it actually uses relatively stock figures from fantasy in a way that we wouldn't have expected him to do. So whether this is kind of in Lovecraft's case, I mean, sort of falling back on received ideas in a way that he would very seldom do. Perhaps that kind of, more than anything else about that story, implies his kind of desperation to get out of where he was then living. I don't know. But the Laval, I think one of the things about Laval, apart from being a critique and a powerful story in its own right, is that he doesn't shirk on the cosmic. There's still that sense of the Lovecraftian monster, and he finds new ways to represent it. I admire that in that tale.
Yeah, well, again, I just wish. I personally thought Ballad of Black Tom should have gone on longer. I think it could have been
Yes.
developed even more than it was. But
Yeah,
ano-
well, maybe you should do that. Yeah.
another writer that well, again, I have a personal connection with is the late W.H. Pugmire.
Ah, yes.
Um, he called himself a Lovecraft fanboy, but he was much more than that. And
Yes.
he developed a fine sense of prose that was very Lovecraftian, but really still his own,
Yes.
because Pugmire was an incredibly well-read writer. He drew
Yeah.
upon Shakespeare. His favorite writers were Shakespeare, Henry James, Oscar Wilde, and Lovecraft. And
Yes.
that's a
Yes.
pretty interesting company there.
Yes.
Unfortunately, he did die a couple of years ago. Sadly, I was there almost at the point of his death. It was a
Yeah.
very sad time, but he left a great legacy of writing. It's mostly in the small press, but you should definitely people out there should definitely try to seek it out. You won't find probably the best writer of prose poetry that we had recently.
Yes. Yes. I think so. Well, I see we're near the end of our. We could go on very much longer, as we both know. We've hardly begun really. This is just the preface to a much longer, indeed, cosmic discussion ranging till the end of time. So I wonder, do we have any last thoughts at all?
Well, it's interesting. I've always been interested to see how there was a time from the 70s to the 80s roughly where horror was a very popular medium. It was a best-selling
Mhm.
field, and lots of writers were doing stuff. Maybe some good, some not so good.
Yeah.
But then the base of the field sort of imploded in a certain sense, and a lot of the work is being done in the small press, and good work.
Yeah.
And I think in a sense that goes back to Lovecraft's own view that of writing as pure self-expression. Writing is not meant to make money. I mean, it's wonderful if you make money by it,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
that's not the essence of writing. The essence of writing is to tell what's inside you. And a lot of the best writers right now are doing that, but unfortunately,
Yeah.
because it's in the small press, it's hard to find. So you gotta make an effort to find it, and yeah, there's some really fine work being done out there in small press, and so I urge you to go out and look for it.
Absolutely. Well, I think I could kind of segue from that and say, in a slavish fashion, but here we are on the Flame Tree, and I'm teasing because actually Flame Tree are a fine lot, and I would point out that they've done two Lovecraftian books, one of which is Lovecraft stories, but the other which is Mythos Tales. It ranges all the way from Lovecraft himself through early influence early on to contemporary writers, some of whom are new to the field. And so here's to Flame Tree Press, who are indeed now bringing horror back in a big way, and with real taste and expertise and knowledge. I suppose at this point from Wallasey, as it grows ever darker, I'll say adieu for now.
And good morning from Seattle, Washington, also.
And we hope to see you all again soon.